Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Gather round for another episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll read Chapter 2 of White Line Fever by Lemmy. Chapter 2 is called 36 Roommates. Let's see what that means. I needed a companion, and one was right there. A guy called Ming, after the Emperor in Flash Gordon. Ming had long hair, and that kind of a long, droopy mustache. We began to hang out in coffee bars and dance halls, and pull other blokes' birds, and generally appall everybody. After a bit of this, it seemed to us that we should take drugs. Not that we knew what they were. So, we got in touch with a friend of mine from when I lived in Anglesey, Robbie Watson of Beaumaris, famous also for its well-preserved castle. Robbie had lived in Manchester and had very long hair, which we thought was a very big thing. We started smoking a bit of dope, and then one night, in the Venetia coffee bar in Llandudno, Rob gave me an ample of speed. Methylamphetamine hydrochloride, with a little skull and crossbones on it. You were supposed to shoot it into your arm. I never fancied fixing anything, and I never have, even to this day. You get into the ritual. I've seen people do weird around needles, shooting water just to have an excuse for getting the needle in their arms. That's what Rob was doing, and he thoroughly recommended that I should try it too. But I put it in a cup of something, chocolate I think, and drank it. There was a poor little girl behind the counter at this coffee bar, and I talked to her non-stop for about 4 or 5 hours. I kept saying to Robbie how it was having no effect on me, and then back I went to this poor devil who was in a kind of alphabetic shock from my babbling. But I felt great, you know, king of the world. Trouble is, it wears off. By the way, Robbie Watson, who was my best friend for a long time, and had a brilliant, dry, ironic sense of humor, has been dead these 20 years, one needle too many. Any questions? But back to me and Ming, or the Ming and I. I was 16 when Ming and I left Wales and headed east to Manchester. Actually, we were chasing after a couple girls whom we had met while they were on holiday in Colwyn Bay. We were going to marry them, and all kinds of but of course, it ended up just being sex as usual. They are much better off than if we had married them, I assure you of that. I don't remember Ming girl's name, but mine was called Kathy. She was a great girl, all 15 years old, and a curious, enthusiastic 15 at that. So when they went back to Stockport, Ming and I followed them. We got a flat in Heaton Moor Road, and we kept meeting people. And they would have nowhere to stay, so we'd let them sleep on the floor, or the sofa, or somewhere. And within a month, there were 36 of us in one room. The only one I remember was Moses, whom he resembled very closely, if all those Charlton Heston films are to be believed. Then Kathy got pregnant. I mean, she was wonderful, but she was also 15. Visions of prison bars. Her father was writing letters to my stepfather calling me an exiled Welsh beatnik. The two of them worked out one of those convenient solutions, and the baby Scene was adopted at birth. I remember Kathy was taking her O-levels at the maternity home, and I used to go and visit her. She got really big, and I used to fall off the bus laughing. "Hello, Porky!" And she'd crack up laughing too. She was a great girl, my first love. I didn't see Kathy again. I don't know why. Funnily enough, she got back in touch with me 2 or 3 years ago, just in time for this book. She said she had found Scene, but I won't go into it here. Let him have his life. As for my living situation, we, the 36 roommates, obviously got flung out pretty quick. The landlord probably wondered why the gas bill was for £200,000. Since Ming, the fearless adventurer, had gone back to Wales, eventually to become a clerk at a social security office, and you tell me there's a grand pattern and a meaning to life, I was alone again. During the time I knew Kathy, and for a couple years after, I was a dosser, which then was a particular occupation among kids in the country. We all used to wear U.S. Army jackets, the waterproof ones with a double lining. You could get them really cheap secondhand, and the thing was to get everyone that you knew to write their names on your jacket in felt-tip pen. So you were covered in these weird autographs, and we'd hitchhike around the country, staying with girls or staying in parked railway carriages or caves or whatever, just visiting women of local persuasion. In those days, it was a great thing to be on the road. It was the time of Bob Dylan with the guitar on the back and the bedroll. A lot of girls like the transient thing. It's a tradition if you think about it. The circus, the army, pirates, rock bands on tour, the girls always find them. I think women see something romantic in a geezer's being here today and gone tomorrow. I like it too, but being a geezer, I would like it, wouldn't I? Those days in the early 60s were great. We'd grow our hair down to our holes and just bum around and live off women wherever we found ourselves. Chicks used to steal food out of the fridge from their parents to feed us, and kind of like bringing a meal to the convicted prisoner on the run. They liked the drama of it, and we liked the food. It wasn't all fun and good times, however. Sometimes when I was hitchhiking, guys would stop their trucks to come and beat me up, or you would wind up getting a lift with some huge trucker. "Hello, son. How far are you going?" "Manchester." "Manchester, right? I'd like to suck your..." The flat in Heaton Moor was like a forerunner to the commune, I guess. If one of you had a chick, it was murder. You'd be surrounded by very big eyes in the darkness, and you knew their night vision was getting better all the time. Sex was a lot more fun then. There weren't dire things attached to it like there are now, and sex should be fun instead of all this stigma. "Oh, you only want one thing?" "Well, of course I do. Don't you?" When it stops being fun, then don't do it anymore, for God's sake. All of us used to go out begging on Mercy Square, and if you got anything, you'd come back and share it. I think we lived mainly on ambrosia creamed rice. You used to have a beer can puncher, and you'd sort of suck it out of the can. It was a great delicacy at the time, much better cold. I believe that is when I acquired my taste for cold food, which I have to this day. I can eat cold steak, cold spaghetti, even cold French fries, and that takes some doing. But if you got enough salt on them, they're alright. Manchester is not many miles from Liverpool, and there was incredible music coming out of both towns during the early 60s, though both cities run through the River Mersey, and so the music scene of that area took the name Mersey Beat. There was even a very well-known band from those days called the Mersey Beats, as well as the Mersey Squares, named after the place we went begging. There were hundreds of bands coming out of Manchester and Liverpool, and they all played the same 20 songs. Some Other Guy, Fortune Teller, Ain't Nothing Shakin' But the Leaves on the Trees, Shake Sherry Shake, Do You Love Me, etc. All the bands from 1961 to 1963 were cover bands, including the Beatles. There was this terrible one-upmanship rivalry going on concerning whether you knew the original artist or not. Like the support band would say, "We're going to play Fortune Teller now by the Mersey Beats," but then the Mersey Beats would come on and say, "We'd like to do Fortune Teller now by Benny Spellman." Of course, that never lasted very long, because they just told the whole audience who the original artist was, right? Another thing that bands would do was take an old standard and rock it up. Rory Storm and the Hurricanes really did a number on Beautiful Dreamer, I recall, and the Big Three had to go at Zippity Doo Dah. It was a unique time with some truly incredible bands. One of them was Johnny Kidd and the Pirates. Johnny Kidd used to wear an eye patch and a striped shirt and pirate boots. Sometimes he'd wear a white shirt with bouffant sleeves. Great get-up. The Pirates had the first strobe light I ever saw, created by the simple expedient of the roadie getting his hands on the club's main switches and turning them all on and off very fast. Their guitar player was Mick Green, who was excellent. I used to carry his guitars to get into their shows for free. Years later, I made a record with Mick. Loners like him never made a reputation then. Eric Clapton got lucky. Being an isolationist worked for him because people sought him out. All the other isolationists, people didn't bother with him. Another great band was the Byrds, nothing like the American Byrds, who was happening around the same time. This Byrds had Ronnie Wood, who later joined the Rolling Stones, playing guitar. The Byrds were magic. Excellent. Far ahead of their time. They only had 3 singles, and they were gone. I used to follow them all over the place, even slept in their van. The band I was in at the time, the Motown Sect, of whom you will hear more in a bit, had the honor of doing a gig with them. I still remember the Byrds lineup: Allie McKenzie singing, Ron and Tony Monroe on guitar, Pete McDaniels on drums, and Kim Gardner on bass. Kim now has a pub/restaurant in Hollywood called Cat and the Fiddle. He was a great bassist, but he hardly plays anymore. A very good-looking band the Byrds were, and Ronnie, especially in those days, was a very charismatic boy. He used to wear a brown herringbone tweed suit, two-tone shoes, and he had a white Telecaster. That was very cool. They were like mods with long hair, which I liked because I would never have my hair cut. See, England has always been very fashion-oriented. Fads came and went very fast. The mods were a very odd sort, at least in my estimation. They had very short hair, combed over to one side, kind of like John Kennedy, but with a rooster tail-like swatch at the back. And they wore trousers made of this very thin cord material with these bright print tropical-style jackets and two-tone shoes. The nearest American equivalent would be the Beach Boys, but we didn't have the surf thing. It was really more in town as far as England was concerned, and the mods used to wear eye makeup too, especially the boys. The crowd of people I was in disliked them, but in retrospect, it was no worse than what we were doing. I mean, we thought they were sissies, and they thought we were yobs, and we were both right. I got to meet a lot of great musicians at the start of our careers. John Lord was one. John Lord was, and is, a consummate musician. He later on played with Deep Purple, Whitesnake, and Rainbow. But when I met him, he was playing for the Art Woods, who, funnily enough, was fronted by Art Wood. Even funnier, Art Wood was Ron Wood's brother. But hold on a moment. There was this huge, great palace of a boozer called the Washington on the seafront at Londonderry, and they had rock shows in the upstairs ballroom. Then they started having jazz and blues nights. They had Graham Bond with Ginger Baker and Dick Hextall Smith. They had the Downliner Sect, Jasmine Allen Skidmore, and then one night, the Artwoods. So I was lounging about the place, staring at the exotic equipment, and I watched them play. Pretty good, I thought, from my lofty critic's perch in North Wales. Anyway, I was talking to John Lord after the show, and he and the band offered me a lift back to Colwyn Bay. I'm sure John's regretted that ever since. The poor fool gave me his address in West Drayton, near London, and about 3 weeks later, off I went. I mean, this impossibly huge star would probably have a huge mansion, and he would probably let me sleep in the servants' quarters and introduce me to other impossibly huge stars with whom I would seek my fortune, etc. Alas for dreams. The address turned out to be a house on a council estate. I arrived at about 3 in the morning and rang the knocker and banged on the bell. A sweet little old lady opened the door. "Yes, who is it?" "It's me," I said. Lemmy from North Wales." "Eh?" "John Lord will remember me. He gave me this address." "Oh, no, dear. He's on tour in Denmark." Why hadn't I considered this possibility? I was young and dumb, that's why. I said. She looked at me. I looked at her. I said. Silence grew between us. Then she said something for which I will be eternally grateful, star-turned that she was. "Oh, well, never mind, dear. You can sleep on the couch, and we'll see you in the morning. You don't get much of that in our brave new world." So I woke to find Ron Wood with 3 of his mates hanging over me going, "Oi, what you a doing on me mum's sofa, eh?" So she was Mrs. Wood, mother of Ron and Art, and John was living there. Coincidence, eh? I got to go to a Byrds gig that night, and then I went to Sunbury on Thames, but more of that later. Back in those days, the most impressive band, hands down, was the Beatles. They were the best band in the world. There will never be anything like the Beatles, and you really had to be there to understand what I've just said. Nowadays, younger people think the Beatles were just a band, but they weren't. They were a huge phenomenon all over the world. Everybody changed because of the Beatles, even politicians. The Daily Mirror in London ran a page every day about what they were doing. Imagine a big national newspaper devoting a page each day to a band. They were more than huge. The Beatles revolutionized rock and roll, and they also changed the way everybody looked. It seems ludicrous now, but for those days, they had very long hair. I remember thinking, Wow, how can any guy have hair that long? Really, it was just combed forward with a slight fringe over the collar. We all had quiffs then. Before the Beatles, it had been DuckTales and Elvis. I was lucky enough to see them play the Cavern Club in Liverpool back at the beginning. They were really fun, eating cheese rolls while singing, and they used to tell a lot of jokes. They were hilarious. They could have been a comedy team. And they had weird guitars that none of us had ever seen. John had his Rickenbacker, and Paul had that violin-shaped bass. All of the rest of us had Stratocasters. I mean, a Strat was the ultimate you could wish for. Gibsons weren't even around. And George, I believe, was playing a Hofner Futurama, God help him. Later on, he got a series of Gretches. It was like, what? These weird guys with long hair and these funny guitars, and they're posing in their shirt sleeves with their ties pulled out. Everybody else was wearing these horrible, rigid suits, encased in these terrible 10-button, suffocating Italian jackets. So that was quite a revelation. And the Beatles were hard men, too. Brian Epstein cleaned them up for mass consumption, but they were anything but sissies. They were from Liverpool, which is like Hamburg or Norfolk, Virginia, a hard seafaring town, all these dockers and sailors around all the time that beat the out of you if you so much as winked at them. Ringo's from the Dingle, which is like the Bronx. The Rolling Stones were the Mummy's Boys. They were all college students from the outskirts of London. They went to starve in London, but it was by choice to give themselves some sort of aura of disrespectability. I did like the Stones, but they were never anywhere near the Beatles. Not for humor, not for originality, not for songs, not for presentation. All they had was Mick Jagger dancing about. Fair enough, the Stones made great records, but they were always on stage, whereas the Beatles were the gear. I remember one gig the Beatles had at the Cavern. It was just after they got Brian Epstein as their manager. Everyone in Liverpool knew that Epstein was gay, and some kid in the audience screamed, "John Lennon's a..." And John, who never wore his glasses on stage, put his guitar down and went into the crowd shouting, "Who said that?" So this kid says, "I did." John went after him and bam! Gave him the Liverpool kiss, sticking the nut on him twice. And the kid went down in a mass of blood, snot, and teeth. Then John got back on the stage. "Anybody else?" he asked. Silence. "Alright then, some other guy." The Beatles opened the door for all the bands that came out of that area. It was like Seattle became in the early 90s. The record labels came up and signed everything that moved. Oriole Records held an audition session in a ballroom that lasted for 3 days. They set up some equipment, and 70-something bands went through and played one song each, and the label signed about half of them. Epstein had other bands besides the Beatles. One of the few he had that didn't make it was called the Big Three. Johnny Gustafson, who later was in Quartermass, Andromeda, and then the Mercy Beats, played bass. The band had a fantastic guitar player, Brian Griffins, who had this old beat-up Hofner Colorama. A horrible guitar with a neck like a tree trunk, but he played unbelievably. And the drummer, Johnny Hutchinson, did all the singing, which was unheard of then. A drummer singing? They were an excellent R&B band, but they got emasculated by the business. The band put out one record that they were happy with, but it didn't make it, so after that they were stuck with 2 Mitch Murray titles. He wrote a lot of those saccharine, sweet pop songs. One of them was How Do You Do It for Gary and the Pacemakers. Those didn't go anywhere either, so Epstein dropped them. It was a shame, because they were a great band. I suppose you could say that these bands were my peer group, a few years older than me, maybe. And I was in bands myself all this time, of course. You were no doubt wondering when I would get around to that. I already had been through the usual local band thing back in Wales, but in those days, putting together a group wasn't easy. You couldn't get equipment for a start. Whether a guy was going to play bass for you rested mainly on if he had a bass or not if he was a good player. And if he had an amp you could all plug into, he was definitely in. It was primitive. I was lucky to have my Hofner Club 50 guitar. I saw it hanging in this music store, Wagstaff's. Old man Wagstaff. He was about 107, and he was an alright guy. He ran an old-fashioned store that would let you take things on spec, put a few quid down, and he'd hold it for you forever. Needless to say, he went out of business. His son took over and immediately sold the store. I think it became a ladies' lingerie shop. It was after seeing Oh Boy, possibly the best rock show ever, and 6-5 Special, which wasn't, I was driven to be a guitar swinger. There weren't many players around in Wales. You'd hear about somebody 3 villages up who had a guitar, and you'd go and interview him. I met Maldwin Hughes somewhere in Convoy when I was living there. He was a drummer, or he had a drum kit. He played in a dance band style, brushes and riveted cymbal, but he was okay for then. We got a guy he knew, Dave. His last name escapes me, but he came to a Motorhead gig last year, who was a good guitarist, but a horrendous person. He had green teeth, and his father, a failed comedian on the dinner club circuit, was always cracking these rotten jokes. Dave, however, thought his old man was hilarious and would quote him when he wasn't there. At first, we called our band the Sundowners, then our second name was the DJs. My first show in front of people was in a basement cafe in Llandudno. My big moment was singing Travelin' Man, a song by Ricky Nelson, who incidentally was a real good singer, and as handsome as few thousand mother. Otherwise, we did a lot of instrumentals by people like the Shadows, the Ventures, Dwayne Eddy, stuff like that. Around the same time, I was also playing with this guy, Tempe. He was an extraordinary person who taught me a lot about sarcasm, and was a most difficult person to get along with. He played bass. I mean, he really played bass. And for about 1.5 hours, we hooked up with the local moody guitarist, Tudor. But what was with Tempe's scornful sarcasm, my amenable insults, and Tudor's eggshell ego? It was no surprise that, although we played together beautifully, that one rehearsal was it. Shows how good it could have been if I remember it 40 years later. That sort of petered out, so back to the DJs. We got a singer, Brian Groves, who was a dark heartthrob sort of guy, a bit like Johnny Gentle, if anyone remembers him. And finally we found a large bass player called John, who was a remarkable rarity in that he had a Fender bass and an amplifier, so he was sort of the Bill Wyman of North Wales, I suppose. My God, we thought, we are made now. But amazingly, we weren't. We played a lot of factory dances and weddings and stuff, and then I got the itch. I knew that wasn't it. Then we kept losing members until it was finally just me and Dave, 2 guitarists and nobody else, so we played instrumentals for a while. That was the DJs. I joined another local band called the Sapphires, but they had this terrible, hyperventilating guitar player who I couldn't put up with. Between that and the Hot Point Factory, you can see why I left Wales. When I arrived in Manchester, I had an Echo in my hand. What a horrible guitar that was. It looked like Liberace's stage jacket made into a guitar, all silver glitters and black, and it had 10 push buttons on it, and only 2 of them worked. The others were just for show. I took the panel off, and they weren't connected to anything. But I swapped it soon enough for a harmony meter, which I should have kept, then traded that in for a Gibson 330, which was a cheap version of the 335. And I changed bands about as often as I'd changed guitars. First the Rainmakers. I don't recall how I got with them, but by the time I joined them, they were already past their prime, and I wasn't in them for very long. After that, I was with another band for about 3 weeks. I don't even remember what they were called. That shows how impressive they were. Then I joined the Motown sect, where I would stay for about 3 years. I met the guitarist Stuart Steele and his bass player Les just from hanging around in Manchester. They had a drummer called Kevin Smith who lived next door to Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, and I joined up as a guitarist and did most of the singing too. I didn't like singing much. I still don't. But I've gotten used to it by now, obviously. After about 2 years, Les left, and we got this bass player whom I knew, name of Glenn, but we called him Glun. Who knows why? Glenn was a very strange individual. He only ever had one girlfriend, and they got into weird sex immediately when they met. She was this chick who used to walk around the sand dunes in Wales, and she always wore this white bikini made out of chamois leather. Very thin, clingy material, and she would never talk to anybody. Nobody knew who she was, but everyone wanted to know her. Then she showed up one day with Glenn, who was going bald already at the age of 20. He was a good-looking guy, though. He looked a little like Dennis Quaid, the actor who played Jerry Lee Lewis in Great Balls of Fire, except he had a mass of blonde, frizzy hair. Anyway, the Motown Sec were a kick-ass R&B band. Stewart was a very good guitarist, well ahead of his time. He had a Gibson Stereo 345, which to everyone else was very big news. And he had a treble-boosted Vox amp too, which was also a big deal. The Sec played exactly the kind of music that I wanted to play, so I fit right in. We only called ourselves the Motown Sec because Motown was very big then, and it got us gigs. But we didn't play any Motown songs at all, not one. We all had long hair, dressed in striped t-shirts, and would play harmonica and sing blues. We did some great covers of Pretty Things tunes and the Yardbirds. On stage we used to say, "Here's one for all the James Brown fans," and the audience would go, "Yay!" Then we'd say, "It's by Chuck Berry and it's called..." Some of the crowd would go for it because they had never heard it before. Some of them would really hate it. But what the could they do? We were on stage, you know, fait accompli. We really had no equipment. No one did in those days. I remember we played at Halifax Town Hall supporting the Pretty Things, and we had one 30-watt amplifier. Can you imagine that? The two stacks I got now are 100 watts each. Back then, it was everyone. Bass, two guitars, and vocal hooked into one 30-watter, about the size of a practice amp. It seems to me I've always played at the same ear-blasting volume, but obviously that's not the case. I suppose back in those days we were taking more care with what we were playing, because you could hear every note, and we always used the house PA. Everybody did, even Hendrix years later. Hendrix used the house PA all through his career in England. Some of the places we played had two 10-inch floor speakers on each side of the stage, with a little metal amp with handles on the back. Hopeless. How we ever did it, I'll never know. But you never know how you did anything when you were 20. You look back and think, me, what was I doing? I didn't do that, surely. Members of the band started to leave eventually. Stewart, as talented as he was, wound up going nowhere, sacrificed himself to his nagging mother and his marriage. Anyhow, I wanted to get out of Manchester, because the band was obviously going nowhere. When I saw the Rocking Vicars for the first time, I knew they were my ticket. Well, that's the end of Chapter 2. Let me know what you guys thought of Chapter 2 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.